Watch out. Here we go. And I'll throw the screen up. We'll talk about our friend, Mr. Reagan here. Okay, got your 3 points and your main points there. What's our date?
1980.
1980. That was the date of, whoops, not that. That's his date of the election. So that's when he became president. Defeated Jimmy Carter. And so 1980 is our date. Ronald Reagan becomes president. Has anybody been to the Reagan Museum or the Reagan Ranch or any of those things?
Mm-mm.
No? Okay. Yeah, you got to do a trip. Things clear up. Okay. So remember to tell a story. Summaries have been very, very good. Overall, really appreciate you guys' efforts. Two more and you're done. And you're 8th graders, so 2 more and you're done with these. Like you're done with your summaries. You don't have to do them again next year. So we got Reagan Revolution, Star Wars, his idea, not mine, and supply side economics. Yeah, 1980 was the year that Empire Strikes Back came out. So there's a reason he references Star Wars. He was an actor, of course. And so he's got Hollywood connections. Big yawn. Okay, Reagan Revolution. Reagan Revolution. Revolution means to turn things upside down. Well, and so you want to, in this paragraph, what was it that Reagan, why is Reagan such a remarkable president? What did he turn upside down? What did he really change when he came in as president? Any ideas?
Took away like a lot of taxes, right?
He took away a lot of taxes. And so you're going to touch on that in this first paragraph, and then we'll get into more detail with the third body paragraph. You can see the word supply side economics. But yes, you basically got 2 poles of the Reagan Revolution. One is he totally took a new approach to the economy that had not been tried for decades. And then in the second paragraph, we'll talk about he changed the approach towards the Soviet Union and the Cold War and basically helped win that war when it was at its low point following Nixon and the defeat in Vietnam and stuff like that. Okay, so the first thing to start out Reagan's revolution was this idea of big government that I'd say almost ever since the New Deal, but especially since Lyndon B. Johnson and the Great Society, government had been growing. And the decades you want to reference here, especially in the 1960s and 70s, if you ever just Google a chart of like government expenditure during the, of how much our US government spends, you'll see a huge spike during the Great Depression, and then you'll see a huge increase in the 1960s and 70s. And that's under Lyndon B. Johnson and the Great Society. And also, even though he was a Republican, Richard Nixon. And a lot of you referenced that correctly in your summaries, that Nixon actually continued and spent even more than Johnson and built upon his programs. So he kind of continued with the mindset that government programs could help people and improve society. Reagan's revolution is he's going to say, no, we're going to head in a new direction because this isn't working. And so he, during this time, the 60s and 70s, a stat is that government spending, federal government spending increased 10,000%. Government spending increased 10,000%. That's a huge bureaucracy. Taxes were really high. There was a lot of inflation. Does anybody know what inflation is? Anybody have any idea what inflation is?
Yeah, that's when like there's too much money, and so then they raise the prices of items. And so
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like your money's not worth very much, and there's kind of too much of a money supply, and so that's why if you've ever looked at the posters and you're like, wow, hamburgers were 10 cents and milkshakes were 5 cents and movies were a penny or 10 cents or whatever, and you're like, why were things so cheap? If it's not like you have to go back to the 1800s or even the 1910s to see that. If you go back to the 1950s and early 60s, that's where those prices were. And where we get more of our modern prices comes from this period of the 60s and 70s, where all of a sudden everything seems to have inflated in expense. And that's due to the effects of government spending, that huge increase, and the Great Society and Nixon building upon that in the 60s and 70s. And so you've got high unemployment, you've got money being worth less than it ever was. You hear people, I bought my first house for $15,000. Yeah, it's because they bought it pre-inflation. National confidence, like people's confidence in their country and their government, was at an all-time low, 23%. So 23%, or 1 in 5 people, thought the government was, in America, was doing a good job. And then, of course, what was Nixon's policy towards the Cold War?
Detente.
Yeah, we say détente, but détente is how I say it in my head, so I can spell it right. But yeah, it's détente, and that means coexistence. So now they'd also given up on winning the Cold War. They just said, well, there's us and there's them, and let's just coexist, and let's get along, and make deals, and let's coexist. So they didn't even think they could win the Cold War. And so the 60s and 70s were a pretty rough time. Crime was at and murder rates were at almost an all-time high. It was a difficult time. There were oil crises where, like, people, gasoline was shooting up. I don't want to make up a number, but it was like double, triple what it normally costs. There were lines to buy gas. It was a real crisis. And so into that sphere, you're setting up the context. Into that steps Reagan and Part B here, a return to conservatism. A return to conservatism. So that's 1980. He wins the presidency, and he mainly wins it on those two things we've talked about. One thing is he calls something, he basically, you may know what conservatism is. The general tenet of conservatism. How you would define that, he's saying we want small government, small, or at least limited government. He'd say there's certain things that it's not government's job to do, and there are some things that government's job is to do. And so the way another way to define conservatism is, you would say low taxes, stay out, let people keep and use their own money, and high military spending, so a strong defense. Because he would say, if you read the Constitution, what the Constitution says is not that government's supposed to take care of us here at home, but it's supposed to protect us. And so its job is not to tax us like crazy so that it can put all these programs into place to make sure we have insurance and healthcare and all these different stuff. That was part of the Great Society and even the New Deal. He said its job is to have a big military. And those are Reagan's two things. He says, we're going to build up the military, and we'll get to this when we talk about Star Wars, and I'm going to cut taxes, which we'll talk about when we talk about supply side economics. But so he's going to approach the country's problems in a radically new way. He says, I want to shrink the size of the government at home in order to increase individual freedom, and I'm going to build up the military to win the Cold War. We're going to defeat the Soviets. One of his, Sam has referenced it several times, but one of his favorite phrases was that, the government is not the solution, but it's the problem. And again, he understood there were roles for government, but what conservatism means is we want to make sure government's limited and only serving in the roles it's designed in the Constitution to do, not let it creep into every aspect of our lives and start controlling, what kind of toilet we can put in our bathroom, or as Mr. Olmsted's finding out which trees we can cut down to build our new school. So that's a return to conservatism. And then the second part of that, and this was his phrase, this was what he would put on buttons and campaign posters, and you can watch old 1980s presidential campaign ads with "Morning in America," which basically was, he came with a sense of optimism and hope in the United States, as well as pride. With détente, it was like, well, we're no better than the Soviets. That's one way of living. We're another way of living. Let people choose. We'll just coexist. Reagan's going to come in and say, no, America, freedom, democracy, capitalism is better. And America is going to rise again. We're not in the decline. We're going to win. We're going to win. And basically, he actually said, a lot of people don't know this, he said, make America great again. Whenever Donald Trump says that, he's actually referencing Ronald Reagan. And because in addition to his policies, what Reagan was saying was, the number one thing we need is to believe in ourselves. We need to restore our confidence and our identity in ourselves in terms of what America means. And that means that we are strong, free individuals. We'll talk about that the rest of the paper. But he was, a lot of people say he was known as the great communicator because he was an actor. So he was really good. He's actually a very shy, private person, I've read, but he was really good. Everyone felt like he was like their father or their grandfather, and he could get up and explain things in kind of basic terms that most people could agree with. He was on TV a lot. He was comfortable being on TV, again, because of his background. And he just really, again, he was just kind of like, hey, let's remember what we're all about, America, and we can win. And that, as much as the actual policies, was important because so much of how we get through things is our psychology. You know, are we confident or are we pessimistic that we can do it? And like we talked a lot about the Vietnam War, where all the capacity to win the Vietnam War was there, but not the leadership and not the confidence to win the war. Reagan's going to be a return to kind of a confidence that, you know, good thing, morning in America means, hey, the day's just beginning. It's not the dark. We're not going to sleep. Things aren't dying. Things are just getting started. And that's kind of how the 80s felt under him. That was part of his revolution. And I'd say one other thing to add to that was he was a Christian. He was a Christian, and he really believed that he really emphasized a return to Christian values, not only American values, but Christian values. And he had a lot of faith-based initiatives. He really partnered with churches and pastors. I forget, did I include the video where he was, I don't think I did. There was an assassination attempt right after he was elected. He was actually shot, and he barely survived. The bullet barely missed a crucial artery in his neck. And he came out of that basically saying, God saved my life. God must want to use me to restore America. And so he really felt like he was, you know, again, his faith was really a big part of what he was doing. And Christianity kind of had a resurgence after being, you know, kind of beaten down in the 60s and 70s, rejected by, you know, in popular culture. Reagan really kind of brought an emphasis back on Christian values, along with just general American values. Okay, we'll talk about the Cold War in the next one. We talk about Star Wars, unless there's a question from the first point. Okay, so Star Wars, we'll reference that in part C. That was a reference to a specific program he had. But to set it up is that coming into 1980, when he was president, the Soviet Union looked, you know, really powerful. The Soviet Union looked like it was winning the Cold War. A couple things made people believe that. One, they had supported North Vietnam, and North Vietnam had won the Vietnam War. Two, they had invaded Afghanistan, and they were taking territory in Afghanistan. Three, they had taken over Czechoslovakia. I'm going to spell that for you guys. Czechoslovakia. So in other words, they were expanding. They were gaining ground. They had supported that. They had won the proxy war in Vietnam. They were taking ground in Afghanistan and Czechoslovakia. So they looked like they were on the ascendance. And again, America, their economy, their unemployment, all the things we just talked about, America looked kind of weak, and that we were negotiating with them because we no longer thought we were strong enough to win. Reagan steps into that, and again, he starts saying things like, we're going to win, and people can't believe it because, again, the Soviet Union has been around since 1949, or actually 1917. And he said, no, we're going to defeat them. And so part B is that you could say Reagan rejects détente. He's like, no way, we are not coexisting with them. And he labels them an evil empire. In his speeches, he always refers to them as the evil empire, the evil empire, the evil empire. And he's making a 1980s reference to Star Wars because that's kind of in the popular culture, the way, you know, at certain points, Marvel or whatever, everyone knows what they're talking about. So everyone knows what he means. And he's basically saying, no, they're not the same as us. He's like, they can't feed their own people. They have to buy grain from us. They have to steal information and technology from us in order to compete. They have to keep their people in line without voting and by secret prisons and secret police. So they're an evil empire, and we're not going to coexist. America doesn't coexist with evil. We're not going to cooperate with them. And he basically says, and you know what? They can't compete with us either. And he basically challenges. He basically says, you know what? We're not going to disarm in order to coexist. We're going to build more weapons. We're going to build out our military, more ships, more planes, more high-tech missiles. And he basically says, I dare you, Soviet Union, to try to keep up. I dare you, communism, to try to keep up with the power of capitalism here in the United States. And so he goes on a huge spending spree, building up the American military, and plans to watch the Soviet Union go bankrupt trying to compete with the United States. So those two things, he takes the moral high ground saying, no, there's no comparison between democracy and communism. No, there's no comparison between people being able to work for themselves and keep what they make versus a society that takes everything from everybody. They can't own anything. They can't even have freedom of religion. He's like, America's better. And he says, let's see whose economy is better. And he spurs the United States to start building. and increasing the size of its military. And so his chief program, and this is what Star Wars references, is the SDI. Does anybody know what that stands for? Or what it is? It was his Star Wars program.
It was a thing to destroy, nuclear missiles before they hit their target, right?
Yes, exactly. Yep. SDI stands for Space Defense Initiative. And that was basically a missile shield. Because if you remember MAD was the idea that we could never get in an open fight with the Soviet Union because we would just destroy each other with nuclear weapons. Reagan goes, well, again, nuts to that. We can figure that out. We can strategically outmaneuver that. Let's design a missile shield so that we can shoot our missiles at them. And if they try to shoot them at us, we'll just shoot them down. And then all of a sudden the stalemate will be broken. And the media thought he was just kind of, they mocked him because they thought he was talking about fantasy. And so the media actually called it Star Wars, like, oh, you're just living in the fantasy world of that space movie everybody likes. And he goes, yeah, I like that name, Star Wars. We'll go with Star Wars. At first it was an insult, and then he just kind of, he co-opted it. But again, it was this missile shield. And what happened is that completely intimidated the Soviet Union, because even though the Soviet Union looked strong on the outside, after decades of what is actually a really poor economic system and oppressive political system, they were beginning to fall apart. And when they saw the Americans building up, and they all of a sudden saw that America had the ability, they knew that the technological breakthroughs, they had stole the atomic bomb. They stole plane designs. They stole information. They didn't really innovate a much stuff on their own. And so when they see the Americans are coming up with this thing called SDI, that really forced them to capitulate and to start negotiating and to feel like, we're falling behind the Americans. And that's where we get the Soviet leader who first recognizes this. I'll write his name because it's Russian, but Mikhail Gorbachev decides to begin to reform Soviet society in order to try to keep up with the United States. And he begins to open up the Soviet Union. He has two programs called, Glasnost and Perestroika. But basically, he opens up the Soviet Union to elections, and he opens up Soviet communication so that they can actually get news and information from around the world. And all that stuff together causes the Soviet Union to collapse. And so in 1989, the Berlin Wall falls down. And in 1991, the Soviet Union officially collapses and ceases to exist. In 1991, you no longer have the Soviet Union. You got to change all the maps because now it's just Russian Federation. And places like Hungary and Turkey and Ukraine and Latvia and Czechoslovakia get to become free states again, free countries again. And so it's really, a lot of people look at Reagan's buildup and basically challenging the Soviet Union to keep up, knowing it couldn't, and then also saying, we're going to out-innovate you with Star Wars being the big example of it, as really, helping bring about the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Again, and you talk to anybody who lived through the 80s. In 1980, it was like, well, there's always going to be the Soviet Union. And then in just 10 years, it's gone. And people can't believe that it happened so quickly. And that was, again, why Reagan's insight from détente to no, we're going to win this war against the evil empire was so transformative, and why you can call it a revolutionary. It was a big deal.
My mom was born in 86.
Who?
My mom?
Oh, your mom was born in 86? Really? I was born in 83. Of course, so I don't remember the 80s, but I can definitely talk to my parents about this. And, they just couldn't believe it. My pastor always tells a story. When he put his kids to bed, they'd pray for the Soviet Union, that the people would be free. And then when they couldn't believe how quick, that it fell just a few years later, and it was just like, it looked like a miracle to people. Nobody thought, how did that possibly take place? Reagan foresaw that.
Mm.
Okay, any paragraph 2 questions? So that's his abroad. That's the one. Remember, there's two poles to conservatism. That's the strong military side, saying, you know what, a strong military actually. Another phrase you could include in that is peace through strength. He's basically said, when you look weak, when you disarm, you actually encourage bad guys to be more bad. is that when you build up the military and you have strong, strong forces, it actually causes people to be good and behave themselves. And so it's not like you're building up your military to threaten people, but people are more likely to obey when there's a strong authority on the scene. And so that he had this idea of peace through strength. So at home, dealing with, again, the high unemployment, the inflation, the high taxes and all that, he took this approach called supply side economics. Some people call this, and again, they were mocking him, and he just went ahead and embraced it. Spell his name right, Reaganomics. And basically, well, we'll get to what Reaganomics is here in a second, but I should have called part B Reaganomics. But when he went for election, he had this thing called the misery index. And he said, he'd say, hey, you know what? If you like the way the economy is, vote for my opponent, vote for Jimmy Carter. If you think things are good, vote for him. But if you're feeling miserable based on this economy, vote for me. And he said the misery index was based on two things. It was what's the unemployment rate and what's the inflation rate. And the United States had both of those, high unemployment and high inflation, where again, people's money just didn't seem to be worth as much. And so the economy was very crippled. They were not producing very much. And again, he approaches it with saying, you know what, the government's in the way. The government is preventing people from building their businesses and hiring more workers because they're taking so much of their money in the form of taxes and regulation. And so what Reaganomics is his solution was to cut taxes. And a lot of people screamed and said, oh, you're cutting, and not just cut taxes on people, though he did cut taxes on people, but he's cut taxes on businesses. And he said, look, you're taking so much from them, they cannot produce things. And if businesses don't produce things, then they can't hire people. And that's why it's called supply side economics. You don't have to go into too much detail, but his idea was if we help the businesses and we take the burden off of them, they'll be able to do more production in the economy. And that means more jobs for people, more pay for people, more money for people. Whereas government, he saw government as almost like this leech, sucking all of the good stuff, or at least too much of the good health from the economy so that businesses couldn't produce and hire as many people as possible. Kind of a cool fact. How does the government get money?
Taxes.
Don't they just like print it?
No, they don't just print it, because then you have inflation.
Well, they're supposed to get like the people and then like also printing it.
Well, it's true. I mean, yeah, money, I think it lasts it's about 2 years, and they have to print more, and they cycle it through. That's how we actually make it. That's true. But they get it through taxes. The government doesn't produce anything. They take it from us. They take taxes from businesses. They take taxes from individuals. But here's the thing. Taxes have gotten so high that, and what Reagan's idea was, he said, you know what, if we tax people less, I bet we're actually going to get more taxes. People are like, what? How can you have a lower tax rate and actually collect more taxes? And he said, you know what, because people, two ways. One, because people are cheating. When people feel like taxes are too high, they lie. They lie about their income. They look for loopholes. They hide their money in bank accounts that that the government doesn't know about, and they don't pay taxes on it. He says when they actually think the tax rates are fair, they'll start paying their taxes. And if they actually start becoming more prosperous, you know, it's kind of like if I make $200, the government gets 10%. It gets, you know, $20 from me. But if I make, you know, $600, then I get to make more money. But that also means the government gets more money. And so he actually cut taxes, and the amount of money the government made increased. Because again, people were more willing to be honest in their taxes, and because people began to be more productive. He wanted what was called a free market, where again, businesses and people could trade and function and run their stores and buy things without a lot of regulation, and again, taxes. And the economy, turned around. The economy in the 1980s absolutely boomed. And for the next 20 years, we have just incredible economic gains because of the lifting of these tax burdens under Reagan. They were so popular that even though Bill Clinton, who's a Democrat, will come in the 1990s, he continues it because he can see he could see that it was working. And so the 1980s are extremely prosperous decade in American history. The other thing that made it so prosperous was that it oversaw the digital revolution. What does that mean? What's getting invented and widespread in the 1980s? Something you just think have always been around.
Cars or the internet? The internet.
Okay,
Computers.
and even a little bit before the internet kind of, though the internet's going to be 1990. But computers, just in general, computers, the ability, that's what so digital means. So the ability to have computers versus, word processors versus typewriters, and passing information and calculations and holding accounts and recording information. That's going to completely transform the American economy. And it's under Reagan, where there's little government kind of like regulation and government taxation of this, that the computer industry really expands and grows and really, again, helps the United States to prosper. Brings a lot of employment, inflation drops, increases production, wealth, and everything goes up. And again, it just, the economy roars to life. And the Soviet, going back to the Soviets, they couldn't come, when they saw that, they just said, it's over. We got to reform. And then when they reformed, their empire fell apart. So the computing industry, the rise of computers, that really was a shot in the arm. And we tend to see that when the government gets out of the way, you tend to get a lot of innovation and new ideas that continue to propel the economy forward. Okay, we just need to do the so what. Any questions about the first 3 points? Again, notice the story, how Reagan brought in a new approach. In the first paragraph, the change in foreign policy in the Cold War, and then the change in economic domestic policy at home. And again, it's like you look at any chart of the stock market and you look at the value of the stock market and just see what happens starting in 1980 all the way through the 90s. It just absolutely soars upward. Okay, so Reagan, why does Reagan matter? You can see 3 reasons there. Number one, I always put it as number one because I think our ideas are the most important thing. You guys are all smart enough. You're strong enough. You're capable of doing all sorts of things. The number one thing that's ever going to stop you is how you see yourself, is your attitude. Your attitude makes the difference of how happy you are and successful you are to a large degree. And that was the number one thing Reagan did when we were talking about mourning in America. He said, he said something crazy. He said, America is good. America is strong. America is capable, and we can get through this. That's something I appreciate about our current president, is he seems to, don't agree with everything he says or how he acts, but he seems to like America. And that can't be said of everybody you talk to, and even some of our own politicians. Michelle Obama, President Obama's wife, when he got elected, she goes, I haven't been proud of America until my husband was elected president. It's kind of like, oh, geez, well, I feel kind of bad, So he really restored American pride and leadership, that America should be the leader of the free world, and that America was a force for good, and not perfect, but that America was a good thing. That the American Trinity really were principles that made America exceptional, and that it wasn't just like any other country, but was somebody who should lead. And that, to me, that's one of the most important things that we need to remember as Americans is what our legacy. It doesn't mean we have to be arrogant. Doesn't mean we have to say we're perfect, but to recognize, hey, we're rich. We got these principles of e pluribus unum, under God, and liberty. There's nothing like them in the world, and nothing can compete with freedom. Nothing can compete with capitalism. And so that's kind of builds into the second idea, is that the key to American success is not even, and this is kind of gets to conservatism. Conservatism means to save the past. It kind of means to remember. It's kind of to look back and remember where you come from. And the idea of America is, he's just basically, we have everything we need to succeed. We have everything we need to help our economy. We have everything we need to win the Cold War, but we need to remember that. We need to embrace it, that we can win if we're confident and brave enough to fight those principles. He had this great quote where he would say that, he'd say, freedom is never more than one generation from extinction. Because if we're not going to pass it on to our children by blood, we're going to have to teach them and remind them what we have and why it's worth preserving, why it's worth conserving, and why it's, the strength of their lives. And so again, he really was this. He didn't really have all these in specific. He was a very simple politician. He was constantly called stupid by the media. He was constantly called kind of simple and ignorant, and he wasn't an expert. And this guy from Harvard or Yale, who was all smart, but he just said, no, I know this. I know the basic stuff. I know the principles. free people living their lives can do more than some expert telling them how to live their lives. And, you know, he used to fall asleep during his meetings. They'd have meetings, especially as he got older. He was a pretty old president, and he'd fall asleep during their meetings. And people would be like, look at this guy. He can't even stay awake. He's, you know, he's hardly alive. And he'd go, I know what I'm doing. I have the best people in the world working for me. The smartest thing I can do as a leader is get out of their way. He's like, you don't need me telling you what to do. I've got good people in charge. They know what to do. Let's let them, you know, run with it. I would just be getting in their way, telling them what to do. He used to sleep in really late. And people were like, oh, look how lazy he is. And he's like, why? The less I do, and that was his idea of the government. He's like, the less the government does, the more free individual people are to go and do actual good things. So the government's just going to get in the way unless it's doing its specific job of protecting the people. And again, all that builds into this idea of what makes America strong. According to Reagan, it was free individuals, free people. They should be free economically, which means they should be able to work and earn money and not be burdened with taxes and regulations. And they should be able to start businesses and innovate. They should be free politically. You know, they should not have this big government telling them what to do and governing all parts of their lives. You know, that's why communism was evil, and he did not agree with socialism. You need free political people, and then free morally. And he would say free from sin. You know, they need to be free from wickedness. They need to be virtuous individual people. And if he says you combine free people, you're going to have a really strong country. A lot of times people think, well, I need a strong country, so that means I need a strong government. He'd say, no, that's completely backwards. He'd say you want a small government that lets people live free, and then you'll have an extremely powerful and unstoppable country. And that's kind of what he put into practice with his Star Wars and the supply side economics. And again, the 1980s were just this huge turnaround for the United States. And again, kind of launched it into where after World War II, you've got the world leaders of Soviet Union and the United States. After Reagan, there's one superpower in the United States, in the world, and that's the United States. And if you want to include it, or just because I think it's important, is this, I think this message is really important right now because it's not the Soviet Union right now, but who's America's #1 competitor?
Themselves.
Well, yeah, amen. Absolutely. No, it's true. And when you get to college, or I don't know what you look at on YouTube or anything, but there's unfortunately, a lot of Americans who don't believe in ourselves and what America means. That's true. So absolutely, I'd say that'd be a huge thing to include there. And then even the other would be the fact that a lot of people are worried about competition from China. And people ask, you know, are you worried about China, and are they going to take over, and will they be able to beat the US in a war? And, you know, are they going to have a more powerful economy and all this stuff? And I love China. I love Chinese people, and it's a wonderful, beautiful, amazing place, but they're communists, and their people are not free, and they are controlled, and they are lied to. And it's coming out even with this virus, that the virus is as bad as it is because they were dishonest. And I think Reagan's message would be, don't ever be afraid of that, because as long as you know your principles and what you stand for, that you're going to be fine, because there's no way that oppression and deception and lies and controlling people is ever going to be able to outcompete free people. And that was kind of Reagan's message against the Soviet Union, but I still think that's an important message today. Okay, any questions about this or anything else? Coronavirus opening. Everybody's family's doing okay?
Probably.
Your family's probably okay?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
It was my grandma's birthday yesterday.
Oh, really? How old is she?
Oh, I have no idea. Probably close to her, I think 70.